the Easter Island statues were never just heads. They have bodies. Massive, intact, fully carved bodies, buried beneath the volcanic soil of Rapa Nui, some of them as deep as 10 meters underground. And what is carved on the backs of those buried bodies, hidden from the cameras and the postcards and the school textbooks for over a century, is something the academic establishment has spent 50 years trying not to discuss in public. Most people who look at the Moai never see what is underneath them. They do not dig. They do not ask why the heads sit at the angle they sit. They do not measure how far the stone continues below the surface. They do not question why every photograph ever taken of these statues, from the first 19th century engravings to the satellite imagery of today, was framed to crop out the soil. And because they do not look down, they do not see what was carved into the backs of the figures by the people who built them. Markings that belong to a writing system no living human on this planet can read. If you want more of these investigations, the kind of buried history the textbooks have spent generations trying to keep out of the public conversation, subscribe to the channel right now. New videos drop every week, and we go after the questions the official record has spent centuries closing. The standard textbook account of Easter Island is something almost everyone has heard. Polynesian voyagers arrived around the year 1200 of the Common Era, traveling in double-hulled canoes from somewhere in the Central Pacific. They settled the island, they organized themselves into clans, and they began carving enormous stone figures from the soft volcanic rock of a quarry called Reino Ruraku. The figures, the textbooks tell us, were memorials to deceased chiefs and ancestors. They were carved at the quarry, transported across the island, and erected on stone platforms called ahu, where they faced inland to watch over the villages of their descendants. Then, the standard story continues. The islanders cut down too many trees. They exhausted their resources. They fell into civil war. The civilization collapsed. And by the time European ships arrived in 1722, the survivors were a handful of starving people living among the wreckage of their ancestors' achievements. This is the version that runs in every documentary, every museum placard, every National Geographic article about the Moai. There are 3 problems with this account, and each one is worse than the last. The first problem is the location. Easter Island is the most isolated, permanently inhabited island on Earth. The nearest inhabited landmass, Pitcairn, is more than 2,000 kilometers away. The nearest continent, South America, is more than 3,500 kilometers to the east. You could drop Easter Island into the middle of the Sahara Desert and it would have more neighbors than it does in the Pacific Ocean. How a Polynesian population, sailing without metal tools and without modern navigation, found this pinprick of land in an empty ocean is a question the textbooks treat as solved. It is not solved. The second problem is the scale. There are 887 Moai on Easter Island. The largest, called El Gigante, would have stood 21 meters tall and weighed 270 tons. Modern engineering analyses estimate that erecting even a single mid-sized Moai would have required sustained coordinated labor by hundreds of people over weeks. Multiply that by 887, on an island whose theoretical peak population was around 3,000, and the conventional account begins to dissolve. The third problem is the transport. The walking statue theory, which proposes that the Moai were rocked side to side by ropes and walked across the island, has been demonstrated in small experiments. But the theory requires intact forest cover, sturdy ropes, and an organized labor force. The island was, by all accounts, already deforested by the time most of the statues were finished. The trees were not there, and the largest Moai, the ones still locked in the quarry, weigh more than any modern crane on the island today could lift. When you stand on Rapa Nui and look at the figures, you are looking at the result of an effort that the documented population could not have produced, in a location that the documented navigation should not have reached, using methods that the documented environment did not support. And that is before you start digging. This leads you to the first impossibility. The bodies beneath the soil and the markings carved on their backs that no one was meant to see. It leads you to the second impossibility, a written language that appears on this island and nowhere else on Earth, a script that not a single linguist on the planet has been able to decipher, despite over a century and a half of trying. And it leads you eventually to the third impossibility, the genetic and botanical evidence that someone reached this island from a continent that, according to the textbooks, the Rapa Nui people should never have known existed. 3 layers, each one stranger than the last. We are going through them in order. In 2010, a team of archaeologists led by Joe and Van Tilburg, the director of the Easter Island Statue Project at UCLA, began a systematic excavation of the Moai still standing in the slopes of Reino Ruraku. For decades, these statues had been photographed as heads. Iconic, isolated, weathered heads emerging from the green volcanic hillside. Tourist guidebooks call them the heads. The official iconography of Easter Island, in the imagination of the global public, was a face without a body. Van Tilburg's team began digging, and what they found beneath the soil rewrote everything. The statues were not heads. They were full figures. The torsos extended downward for as much as 10 meters beneath the surface. The arms were carved in complete detail, folded across the lower body, with elongated fingers resting on the abdomen in a posture that archaeologists immediately recognized as ceremonial. The bodies had been there the entire time. They had simply been buried deeper than anyone had bothered to excavate, for centuries. But the discovery that mattered most was not the bodies themselves. It was what was carved on them. On the backs of the buried figures, hidden from any observer above the surface, were elaborate petroglyphs. Spirals, crescents, stylized fish, strange humanoid figures with raised arms, and other symbols whose meaning has not been determined to this day. These were not random decorations. They were arranged in patterns. They had been carved deliberately by the same hands that shaped the statues, and then they had been concealed by burial. The conventional explanation offered by the official record is that natural sediment slowly accumulated around the lower portions of the statues over the centuries. This explanation does not survive contact with the evidence. The depth of the deposits, 10 meters in some cases, does not match the natural erosion rate of the surrounding hillside. The composition of the soil around the statues does not match the surrounding sediment. The stratification suggests that the burial was rapid, deliberate, and contemporaneous with the carving itself. In plain language, whoever made the statues also buried them. The same pattern, building something extraordinary, carving symbols on it, and then deliberately burying it, has been documented at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey 10,000 years before anyone touched a Moai. The impulse, separated by oceans and millennia, was the same. The question that Van Tilburg's team raised, and that the official narrative has had no answer for, is straightforward. What were they hiding? Or, perhaps more unsettling, what were they sealing in? In 1864, a French missionary named Eugene Arod arrived on Easter Island. He came with the standard equipment of 19th-century missionary work: a Bible, a journal, and a deep curiosity about the people he had come to convert. What he found in the homes of the Rapa Nui shocked him. In nearly every household, hanging from the rafters or wrapped in cloth and stored in baskets, were wooden tablets covered in incised symbols. Hundreds of them. Possibly thousands. The islanders called the script Rongorongo. They told Arod that the symbols were sacred, that only certain trained men could read them, and that the meaning was passed down through initiation, not through writing or speech. By the time the missionaries had finished their work, almost all of the tablets were gone. They were burned by the new Christian converts, buried by suspicious elders, taken to Europe in the holds of merchant ships, lost in shipwrecks, or destroyed by the islanders themselves, under pressure from a religion that called the script the work of demons. Of the thousands that may have existed, only 26 are known to survive today. They are scattered across museums in Rome, London, St. Petersburg, Santiago, Honolulu. They are some of the rarest artifacts in the world. and not a single linguist has been able to read them. The script of Rongorongo is unlike any other writing system on Earth. It is written in a style called reverse boustrophedon, where the reader reads one line from left to right, then turns the entire tablet upside down to read the next line, alternating direction with each row. The symbols themselves are intricate. Stylized birds, fish, plants, human figures, geometric forms, abstract glyphs whose reference are unknown. They are carved in shallow grooves on hardwood panels with a precision that suggests practice, training, and tradition. This is not the work of a culture that just invented writing. This is the work of a culture that had been writing for a very long time. Which raises the question that the linguists have been unable to answer for over 150 years. Where did it come from? Polynesia, as a whole, did not have a written language. The cultures of Hawaii, Samoa, Tahiti, the Marquesas, the Cook Islands, all of them transmitted their knowledge orally. None of them developed a script. Easter Island, the most isolated outpost of the Polynesian world, the smallest and most remote of all the inhabited islands of the Pacific, somehow developed the only writing system in the entire region. It appears nowhere else. It has no obvious ancestor. It has no descendants. It exists on this single 20 by 20 kilometer rock, in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet, and then it disappears. In the 1950s, a German ethnologist named Thomas Barthel proposed that some of the glyphs corresponded to a lunar calendar. The reading was suggestive but incomplete. In the 1990s, the American researcher Stephen Fisher offered a partial decipherment of one tablet, claiming it was a procreation chant. The reading was not generally accepted. The tablets remain, in the consensus view of professional linguistics, unreadable. We have computers that can decipher languages no one has spoken in 5,000 years. We cannot read a script that was being read out loud on this island within living memory. It was not invented locally. It was already old when the Europeans arrived, which means it came from somewhere. Now we come to the third layer. And this is the layer that, when assembled with the previous two, transforms the story of Easter Island from an isolated curiosity into something much larger. In the gardens of Easter Island, when the Europeans arrived in the 18th century, they found a crop the islanders had been cultivating for centuries. The sweet potato. The Rapa Nui called it kamar. The plant was not native to Polynesia. It was native to South America. And it had been growing on Easter Island for at least 400 years before any European ship was capable of carrying it across the ocean. For decades, this fact was treated as an inconvenient anomaly. The official explanation was that the sweet potato had somehow drifted across the Pacific on its own, carried by ocean currents. This was botanically implausible. Sweet potato tubers do not survive months at sea in salt water. They cannot germinate after that kind of exposure. The crop did not drift. Someone carried it. Then, in 2014, a study published in the journal Current Biology delivered the result that changed everything. A team of geneticists analyzed the DNA of modern Rapa Nui people and of preserved Rapa Nui remains, and found something the textbooks had insisted was impossible. The genetic profile of the islanders contained approximately 8% Native American admixture. And the dating of that admixture, based on the rate of genetic recombination since the moment of mixing, placed the contact between the Rapa Nui and a Native American population somewhere between the years 1280 and 1495 of the Common Era. Before Columbus. Before any European had reached the New World, let alone the Pacific. Before the conventional history says any kind of trans-Pacific contact was possible. The sweet potato had not drifted. The Rapa Nui had not invented their script in isolation. Someone had crossed the ocean. Either a Polynesian voyaging party reached the coast of South America and returned with crops, knowledge, and possibly partners. Or a South American voyaging party reached Easter Island and brought the same. The DNA does not distinguish which direction the contact ran, but it confirms that the contact happened. And once you accept that contact, the rest of the puzzle aligns. The megalithic stone-fitting techniques used in the Ahu platforms of Easter Island, where massive blocks are joined without mortar in interlocking polygonal patterns, bear a striking resemblance to the techniques used at Tiwanaku, at Ollantaytambo, at Sacsayhuaman in the Andes of South America. The same impossible precision, the same interlocking joints, the same questions about how the work was done with the tools officially available. Either two completely unrelated cultures, separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, independently developed the same extraordinarily sophisticated masonry tradition. Or they were not unrelated, and the techniques traveled with the people who carried the sweet potato. So what was Easter Island really? When you put the three layers together, the buried bodies with their hidden petroglyphs, the unreadable script that should not exist, the genetic and botanical evidence of trans-Pacific contact, a different picture begins to emerge. Easter Island was not the dead end of Polynesian expansion. It was not the isolated tragedy of a self-destructive civilization. It was a node, a meeting point, a place where two oceanic traditions, the Polynesian and the South American, came into contact, exchanged knowledge, and built something together that neither could have built alone. The Moai, in this reading, are not monuments to local chiefs. They are markers, boundary stones at the edge of the Polynesian world, facing inland to watch the island, but standing at the threshold between two civilizations whose histories the textbooks have insisted never met. The petroglyphs on their backs were sealed underground because the meaning they carried was meant for a different audience than the one above the soil. The Rongorongo script was not invented in 1770. It was the inherited memory of a tradition that connected this island to something older and larger than the conventional history allows. When the burial happened, when the statues were lowered into the soil and the symbols on their backs were hidden, an era ended. The connection between the worlds was broken. The script became unreadable because the people who could read it stopped passing the knowledge on. The island became, in the eyes of the next century of European observers, the isolated curiosity it appears to be in the textbooks today. But the bodies are still there. The script is still there. The DNA is still there. And anyone willing to look down, instead of just looking at the heads, can still see what the people who built this place were trying to record. The Easter Island statues were never just heads. They were never just monuments to local ancestors. They were the visible part of something the people who built them deliberately tried to bury. And every photograph that crops the soil out of the frame, every textbook that calls them the heads, every documentary that ends the story with ecological collapse, is part of the same long act of forgetting. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with somebody who is willing to ask the harder questions. And keep watching because there is more to come. This has been the Hidden History Vault. The vault is never truly empty.